Behind the biblical spectacle of the prodigal lies a treasure trove of Hollywood chaos. A star who literally cut up her costumes with scissors, a co-star notorious for his garlic breath, footprints mysteriously removed from Grauman's Chinese theater, and an epic battle with a rubber vulture. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about The Prodigal. Fact 1. Lana Turner took scissors to her own costumes. When Lana Turner showed up on the set of The Prodigal in 1955, she was already deeply unhappy about being cast in the film. The studio had essentially forced her into the role of Samara, the seductive high priestess of the goddess Astarte, and she found everything about the production ridiculous. But nothing irritated her more than the costumes designed by Herschel McCoy. These elaborate outfits were dripping with heavy metal beads and constructed from stiff materials that made her feel like she was wearing armor rather than the flowing garments of an ancient temptress. Turner's daughter, Cheryl Crane, later revealed that her mother had told makeup artist and friend Del Armstrong, "If they're going to make me do this, I'm going to do it naked." While she didn't go quite that far, Turner did take matters into her own hands in the most literal way possible. She grabbed a pair of scissors and began cutting away at the costumes herself, removing the flesh-colored netting that had been carefully sewn into the designs to maintain some level of modesty. Turner wanted to show actual bare skin instead of fabric that merely suggested it. In her 1982 autobiography, she explained her rebellious attitude, writing, "Well, I thought I may be trapped in this picture, but I'm going to make myself as sensuous, sexy, and gorgeous as possible." The result of her DIY costume alterations was exactly what she intended. The outfits became so revealing that decency groups publicly denounced her, and some movie theater exhibitors were forced to take the extraordinary step of airbrushing promotional photographs to paint over her exposed navel before displaying them in their lobbies. Fact 2. Theater owners airbrushed her navel in promotional photos. The controversy surrounding Lana Turner's costumes in The Prodigal didn't end when filming wrapped in 1955. As MGM began distributing promotional materials to movie theaters across the country, theater owners found themselves facing a serious problem with the publicity photographs they received. The images of Turner in her revealing priestess costumes were simply too scandalous for many communities to display in their lobbies and on their marquees. Decency groups had already begun denouncing Turner and the film for what they considered inappropriate and immoral costuming, putting pressure on local theater owners to do something about the promotional materials. Rather than refusing to show the film or leaving their display cases empty, certain exhibitors took an unusual approach. To solve the problem, they hired artists to manually airbrush the publicity stills, literally painting over portions of Turner's exposed body in the photographs before putting them on public display. The most commonly censored area was her navel, which was clearly visible in many of the promotional shots due to her modified costumes. This practice of altering publicity materials wasn't mandated by the studio or part of any official policy, but rather represented individual theater owners trying to avoid complaints from local community groups and religious organizations. The 4-month production had cost MGM a significant amount of money, and the studio was already nervous about the film's reception. But even they couldn't have predicted that some theaters would go so far as to physically alter the promotional images just to make them acceptable for public viewing. The airbrush controversy became yet another embarrassing chapter in the troubled history of The Prodigal's release. Fact 3. Edmund Purdum's garlic breath made Lana Turner miserable. Lana Turner's unhappiness on the set of The Prodigal went far beyond her hatred of the costumes and the script. She also had to deal with her leading man, Edmund Purdum, who played the wayward son Micah opposite her seductive priestess Samara. Years later, when Turner sat down to write her autobiography, she didn't hold back about her experience working with Purdum during those 4 months of filming in 1955. She described him as a young man with a remarkably high opinion of himself, suggesting that his arrogance and pomposity made him difficult to work with on a daily basis. But Turner saved her most memorable complaint for something far more personal and uncomfortable. She wrote that his pomposity was hard enough to bear, but worse yet was the garlic breath he brought back from lunch. This wasn't just a one-time occurrence that Turner laughed off, but rather an ongoing problem throughout the production that made their intimate scenes together particularly unpleasant. Turner also admitted in her memoir that she found her dialogue in the film to be incredibly stupid, writing that her lines were so bad that she hated to go to work in the morning. The combination of terrible dialogue, uncomfortable costumes, and having to perform romantic scenes with a co-star whose lunch choices left him with persistent garlic breath created a perfect storm of misery for the actress. It's worth noting that Turner rarely spoke negatively about her co-stars in such specific terms, which makes her willingness to call out Purdum's garlic breath in her published autobiography all the more remarkable and unusual. Fact 4. The studio boss called it his worst film ever. It's extremely rare for a Hollywood studio executive to publicly denounce one of their own productions, but Doris Sherry, who served as head of production at MGM during the 1950s, made an exception for The Prodigal. In later interviews, when reflections on his career, Sherry didn't mince words about his feelings toward the biblical epic that he had personally championed and pushed into production. He called The Prodigal the biggest and most embarrassing failure of his entire tenure at MGM, going even further to describe it as the worst film he ever supported during his time leading one of Hollywood's most prestigious studios. What makes this admission even more remarkable is that Sherry initially believed in the project and thought the script would draw audiences to theaters. He later explained that the sorry fact was that he genuinely liked the screenplay when he first read it, believing it had commercial potential. Sherry also admitted that he had to hustle Lana Turner into accepting the role, essentially pressuring the star into a film she didn't want to make. The studio head's realization that something was terribly wrong came surprisingly early in the production process. After just 2 weeks of filming, Sherry could already see that they were in quicksand, as he put it, with the project sinking fast. He even went so far as to ask the MGM production office to calculate exactly how much money the studio would lose if they abandoned the film entirely at that point. What he forgot, as he later reflected, was that Cecil B. DeMille had an exclusive on Bible films, and audiences simply weren't interested in MGM's attempt to compete in that genre. Fact 5. MGM considered abandoning the film mid-production. When Doris Sherry realized that The Prodigal was heading toward disaster after only 2 weeks of filming, he didn't just complain about it privately. He actually took the extraordinary step of asking the MGM production office to run the numbers and figure out exactly how much money the studio would lose if they simply pulled the plug on the entire production right then and there. This kind of calculation was extremely unusual for a major studio film that had already begun shooting, but Sherry was desperate to know if cutting their losses immediately would be better than continuing forward with a movie he already knew was doomed. The production office came back with sobering news that essentially trapped MGM into finishing the film whether they wanted to or not. By that point, the studio had already spent enormous amounts of money on various aspects of the production that couldn't be recovered or reused. Massive elaborate sets depicting ancient Damascus and the temples of Baal and Astarte had been constructed on the MGM lot at considerable expense. More than $200,000 alone had been spent just on the hundreds of ornate costumes that filled the film's wardrobe department. Beyond the physical production elements, the studio had also signed binding contracts with actors, crew members, and various other personnel involved in making the movie. When the accountants added up all these sunk costs, they determined that abandoning The Prodigal at that stage would result in a petit loss of $1.2 million. Faced with that staggering figure, MGM had no real choice but to continue shooting and hoped they could somehow recoup their investment when the film was released to theaters, even though everyone involved already suspected it would be a commercial and critical failure. Fact 6. The costume designer died shortly after completing the film. Herschel McCoy had been building an impressive career as a costume designer in Hollywood when he took on the massive challenge of creating the wardrobe for the Prodigal. Born in Mississippi in 1912, McCoy had started his career at 20th Century Fox in the 1930s, working primarily on lower-budget films and serials featuring characters like Charlie Chan and Mr. Moto. By 1951, he had graduated to more prestigious projects at MGM, where he earned 2 Oscar nominations for his costume work and contributed to major productions like Quo Vadis. The Prodigal represented one of his most ambitious projects yet, requiring him to design hundreds of elaborate costumes that would fill the screen in the new CinemaScope format. McCoy created everything from the ornate beaded gowns worn by Lana Turner as the priestess Samara to the flowing robes of the Hebrew characters and the elaborate ceremonial garments used in the temple scenes. Despite the controversy surrounding some of his designs, particularly after Turner modified them herself, McCoy's work on the film demonstrated considerable skill and attention to historical detail. He was only 42 years old when he completed his work on The Prodigal, still relatively young for someone in his profession and seemingly at the height of his creative powers, with many productive years potentially ahead of him. Tragically, The Prodigal would turn out to be Herschel McCoy's final film credit. He died suddenly on February 3, 1956, in Los Angeles, less than a year after the movie's release in May of 1955. His death cut short what had been a promising career trajectory, leaving behind a body of work that showed his evolution from low-budget genre films to lavish Hollywood spectacles. Fact 7. This was also Francis L. Sullivan's final film. The Prodigal holds the unfortunate distinction of being the final film appearance for not just one, but 2 members of its cast. British character actor Francis L. Sullivan, who played the unscrupulous moneylender Bosra in the film, passed away on November 19, 1956, making this biblical epic his last work for the screen. Sullivan had enjoyed a long and distinguished career in both British and American cinema, with notable roles in classics like Great Expectations and Oliver Twist, where he memorably portrayed Mr. Bumble. He was also a close friend of mystery writer Agatha Christie and had played her famous detective Hercule Poirot in stage productions. By the time he appeared in The Prodigal, Sullivan was a respected, veteran actor known for bringing depth and personality to supporting roles. What makes his final appearance particularly bittersweet is that despite the film's overall poor quality and negative reception, critics singled out Sullivan's performance as one of the few bright spots in an otherwise troubled production. Reviewers noted that he deliciously added something special to each of the scenes he appeared in, bringing a level of professionalism and character work that elevated his sequences above the surrounding material. Even film historians looking back at The Prodigal decades later have acknowledged that Sullivan's performance stood out in a movie where most of the cast seemed uncomfortable or disengaged. While it's unfortunate that such a talented actor's final screen role came in a film that was widely considered a failure, Sullivan at least had the satisfaction of knowing that his individual work was recognized and appreciated even when the movie around him was being criticized and mocked. Fact 8. Edmund Purdom replaced Marlon Brando in his previous epic. Edmund Purdom's journey to starring in The Prodigal was directly connected to one of the most famous casting changes in 1950s Hollywood. Just 1 year before The Prodigal began production, Purdom had been thrust into the spotlight when he was chosen to replace Marlon Brando in the title role of the Egyptian, 20th Century Fox's most expensive production of 1954. Brando had originally been cast as the physician Sinuhe, but dropped out of the project at the last minute, reportedly due to conflicts with director Michael Curtiz. The studio was desperate to find a replacement quickly, and Purdom, who had appeared in a small role in Julius Caesar alongside Brando, was selected from several candidates, including John Derek, John Cassavetes, and Cameron Mitchell. This unexpected opportunity catapulted Purdom into leading man status virtually overnight, earning him the nickname the Replacement Star in Hollywood circles. When The Egyptian was released, it became a major box office success, and MGM studio head Dor Sherry publicly announced that his studio would build up Purdom as a major star. The Prodigal was intended to be MGM's showcase for their new leading man, their biggest and most lavish production of 1955. On paper, Purdom's situation looked incredibly promising. He had just starred in the biggest production of 1954 for one studio and was now headlining the biggest production of 1955 for another studio, an almost unprecedented 1-2 punch of multi-million-dollar spectacles. However, despite this remarkable opportunity, both films ultimately failed to turn Purdom into the superstar that Hollywood executives had hoped for, and his career never achieved the heights that seemed within reach during those 2 brief years. Fact 9. Edmund Purdom's footprints were removed from Grauman's Chinese theater. Edmund Purdom holds one of the most unusual and embarrassing distinctions in Hollywood history as the only person to ever have his hand and footprints removed from the famous forecourt of Grauman's Chinese theater. Getting your prints immortalized in cement at this iconic Hollywood landmark has long been considered one of the highest honors in the entertainment industry, reserved for only the biggest stars and most significant talents. Purdom received this prestigious honor on September 1, 1954, just 6 days after the premiere of The Egyptian, which was only his 3rd credited film role. The ceremony seemed to confirm that Purdom had truly arrived as a major Hollywood star and that his career was on an unstoppable upward trajectory. However, the celebration was incredibly short-lived. The decision to honor Purdom so early in his career, before he had really proven himself as a bankable star, sparked immediate and intense criticism throughout the film industry. Many people felt that the honor had been given prematurely and that Purdom hadn't earned the right to be placed alongside legendary performers whose prints surrounded his. The outcry became so loud and persistent that the theater took the extraordinary step of removing Purdom's handprints and footprints from the forecourt, essentially erasing him from this hallowed Hollywood institution. The empty space where his prints had been was eventually filled by the handprints and footprints of Yul Brynner, who by that time had established himself as a genuine movie star. The whereabouts of Purdom's removed cement block remain unknown to this day, making them a lost piece of Hollywood history and a permanent reminder of his brief and ultimately unsuccessful moment in the spotlight. Fact 10. The film features an absurd fight with a rubber vulture. Perhaps among all the problems that plagued The Prodigal, perhaps nothing has become more infamous over the decades than the scene featuring Edmund Purdom's character fighting off an attacking vulture. The sequence occurs about 1 hour and 29 minutes into the film when Micah finds himself in mortal danger and must battle the menacing bird. Unfortunately for everyone involved in the production, the special effects department created what can only be described as an obviously fake mechanical vulture puppet that looks nothing like a real bird. The rubber creature flaps its wings in a stiff, unconvincing manner, while Purdom wrestles with it in what was clearly meant to be a dramatic and suspenseful moment, but instead comes across as completely ridiculous. Multiple reviewers over the years have singled out this vulture attack as one of the most unintentionally funny scenes in biblical epic history, with some critics noting that even though almost all the other production values in the film are quite high, the special effect vulture stands out as spectacularly bad. The scene has taken on a life of its own in the world of cult cinema and bad movie appreciation, becoming the kind of moment that fans actively seek out and share with others. One film reviewer specifically recommended that people skip watching the entire boring film and just find the vulture fight scene on YouTube instead, suggesting that those few minutes contain all the entertainment value the movie has to offer. The fact that this absurd puppet fight has become the most memorable and talked about element of an expensive MGM production that cost millions of dollars only adds to the legendary status of The Prodigal as one of Hollywood's most notorious misfires. Fact 11. Mad Magazine parodied it as The Prodigious. The Prodigal's reputation as a campy, over-the-top disaster was solidified just months after its release, when Mad Magazine decided to feature it in one of their famous movie parodies. In issue number 26, published in November of 1955, the satirical magazine ran a lengthy parody titled The Prodigious, which mercilessly mocked every aspect of the biblical epic that MGM had hoped would be taken seriously. The parody featured artwork by the legendary comic artist Wally Wood, who created detailed illustrations that exaggerated the film's already outrageous costumes, sets, and dramatic moments. Harvey Kurtzman, who was Mad Magazine's founding editor and one of the most influential figures in American comedy, wrote the text that accompanied Wood's artwork. The parody didn't just make fun of individual scenes or performances, but rather highlighted how the entire production represented the kind of Hollywood excess and self-importance that Mad Magazine loved to skewer. For a film to be parodied in Mad Magazine so quickly after its release was a clear sign that it had become a cultural talking point, though not in the way that MGM had intended. Rather than being remembered as a serious religious epic that competed with the successful biblical films of the era, the prodigious parody helped cement the Prodigal's legacy as something audiences were supposed to laugh at rather than be moved by. The fact that Mad Magazine chose to devote significant space to mocking the film indicated that it had already become notorious enough in popular culture to be worth satirizing, ensuring that even people who never saw the movie would know about its reputation as a ridiculous spectacle. Fact 12. There's a glaring anachronism. With written English, historical accuracy was clearly not a top priority for the filmmakers behind The Prodigal, as evidenced by one particularly glaring mistake that viewers have pointed out over the years. In one scene, Edmund Purdam's character Micah writes a message on a wall that reads, "Samara, 1 piece of silver, Micah," presumably as some kind of advertisement or declaration about the priestess he's obsessed with. The problem with this moment has nothing to do with the content of the message, or even the fact that someone would write such a thing on a public wall. The real issue is that the message is written in clear, readable English, which creates an enormous historical impossibility that breaks the entire illusion of the film's setting. The Prodigal takes place in 70 BC, primarily in Damascus, Syria, during a time when the languages used in that region would have been Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, or possibly Latin for official Roman communications. The English language as we know it wouldn't even begin to exist for many centuries after the time period shown in the film. In fact, written English in any form recognizable to modern audiences didn't develop until well over 1,000 years after the events depicted in The Prodigal. The filmmakers apparently decided that having characters write in historically accurate ancient scripts would be confusing or meaningless to American movie audiences, so they simply had Purdam write in plain English and hoped nobody would think too hard about the absurdity of that choice. This kind of anachronism was unfortunately common in Hollywood biblical epics of the 1950s, where entertainment value and audience comprehension were prioritized over historical authenticity. But it still stands out as a particularly lazy example of not caring about getting the details right. Fact 13. Dancer Tina Elg made her Hollywood debut. While The Prodigal may have been a disappointment for most people involved, it did serve as the launching pad for at least one successful career. Finnish ballet dancer Tina Elg, spelled T-A-I-N-A-E-L-G, made her American film debut in the movie playing the role of Elissa, a beautiful slave girl who becomes part of the film's romantic subplot. Elg was born in Helsinki, Finland in 1930 and had been training in dance and acting from a young age. Her international reputation began to grow when she joined some of Europe's most prestigious ballet companies, including the famous Sadler's Wells Company in London, which would later become known as the Royal Ballet and the Grand Ballet du Marquis de Cuevas in Paris. A serious injury eventually forced her to reconsider her future as a professional dancer. But this setback turned into an unexpected opportunity when she was discovered in London by American film producer Edwin H. Knopf. MGM was looking for fresh talent to bring to Hollywood, particularly in the wake of the spectacular success that fellow Scandinavian actress Anita Ekberg was having in American films. The studio decided to sign Elg to a standard 7-year Hollywood contract and cast her in The Prodigal as her introduction to American audiences. Although the film itself was a failure, Elg's performance was noticed, and she went on to have a successful career in both film and theater. Just 2 years after The Prodigal, she won a Golden Globe Award for Best Foreign Newcomer and appeared in the Gene Kelly musical Les Girls in 1957. She also had a long and distinguished career on Broadway, appearing in numerous musical productions and earning a Tony Award nomination for her work in the stage version of Where's Charlie? Fact 14. Ava Gardner and Vittorio Gassman were the original leads. The Prodigal that audiences eventually saw in theaters was very different from the film that MGM originally planned to make. When the project was first being developed, the studio had a completely different cast in mind for the leading roles. Edmund Purdom was always intended to play Micah, the wayward son at the center of the story, but his original co-stars were supposed to be two much bigger names. Ava Gardner, one of the most glamorous and sought-after actresses in Hollywood during the 1950s, was initially cast as Samara, the seductive high priestess who leads Micah astray. Italian actor Vittorio Gassman was also attached to the project in a major role. However, both Gardner and Gassman eventually dropped out of the production for reasons that were never fully explained publicly. Their departure left MGM scrambling to find replacements who could carry a major biblical epic that the studio was planning to make their biggest and most expensive release of 1955. This is where Lana Turner entered the picture, though not by her own choice. Studio head Dor Sherry later admitted in interviews that he hustled Turner into taking the role, which is Hollywood speak for using pressure and persuasion to get an actor to accept a part they don't really want. Turner was under contract to MGM, which gave the studio significant power to assign her to projects whether she wanted to do them or not. Sherry essentially forced her into playing Samara, despite the fact that she found the entire concept of the film ridiculous and had no interest in appearing in a biblical epic. This casting change set the tone for the entire troubled production, starting with a lead actress who resented being there from day one. Fact 15. The film was completely shot on the MGM lot, not in the Holy Land. During the pre-production phase of The Prodigal, Hollywood trade publications like The Hollywood Reporter ran news items suggesting that the production would include location filming in the Holy Land, which at that time referred to Palestine. These reports created expectations that audiences would see authentic Middle Eastern landscapes and architecture as the backdrop for this biblical story set in Damascus and the surrounding region in 70 BC. The idea of filming on location would have added a level of authenticity and spectacle to the production, giving it genuine connection to the places where the story was supposed to take place. However, these ambitious plans for overseas filming never actually materialized. When production began, MGM made the decision to shoot the entire film on their studio lot in Culver City, California, without ever sending cast or crew to the Middle East. Every single frame of The Prodigal, from the opening scenes in the Hebrew village of Joppa to the elaborate temple sequences in Damascus, was filmed on sound stages and backlot sets constructed specifically for this production. The art department built massive and expensive sets to represent ancient Syria, including the towering temples dedicated to the gods Baal and Astarte, the marketplaces, the palace interiors, and the various streets and buildings that made up the film's version of Damascus. While these sets were certainly lavish and filled the wide CinemaScope screen with impressive visuals, they were entirely artificial creations built in Hollywood rather than real locations. This decision to abandon location filming was likely made for practical and financial reasons, but it also meant that the film lost whatever authenticity it might have gained from actually shooting in the regions where the story takes place.